It's time for the headliner, presented to you by Miller Lite. And today's guest is Scott Wheeler, NHL draft and prospects writer for The Athletic. Scott, I'm really excited to talk to you today. We are just a few days away from the NHL draft. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited for the big day. It's been a long time coming, so I'm looking forward to finally getting into it here.
I know, and us Red Wings fans are really excited because we haven't had much Red Wings news over this last few
Right.
months here. So let's get right into it. As we approach this draft, the Red Wings have the fourth overall pick, and we've been taking a look at some of the top prospects all across the board throughout the past couple of weeks. And your list of the top prospects actually was really intriguing to me because there were some differences compared to some of the
Yeah.
other lists with the top prospects that we've been discussing. But we'll get to that. First of all, I want you to tell us what processes you go through, what system you use when you're coming up with this final top prospects list.
Well, it's a process that is really a year and a half, almost 2 years in the making. I start really diving in on the draft class of a year ahead of time in about February. So I'll normally release in February of the year that precedes the actual draft class. I'll normally release kind of a preliminary look at here are the players I'm keeping an eye on at the top of the draft, and then throughout the year I'll release 4 or 5, sometimes 6 installments of updates, if you will, of that draft class. So it's been a long time coming. This draft class has obviously run a little bit longer with everything that happened in terms of it getting pushed from its typical sort of summer date into the fall here. But my process is just being in the rink as much as I possibly can be. I have a travel budget at The Athletic that I use to travel the hockey world to see these kids play at all the major tournaments, college hockey games, junior hockey games here in Ontario. They've got the OHL right in my backyard here in Toronto, obviously. And then just really just digging in on researching these kids, talking to their coaches, talking to their general managers, talking to their agents, other scouts. So it kind of becomes a blend, if you will, of the work that I've done over the course of a year and a half, 2 years on a lot of these kids. But you can't, doing the job that I do, even with the luxury that I have at The Athletic to have the kind of sort of workflow that I do and be able to travel and see all these kids play. Even doing that, it's impossible to see in a draft class the 300, 350 kids that you probably need to see, to be quite honest, to be comfortable with everyone. So there are kids I've seen dozens of times. The top kids in particular, I've seen them play ad nauseum. I get tired of watching them play. And then there are other kids maybe a little bit further down the board that I've only seen 2 or 3 times over the course of a couple of years. So it's a balancing act, and it's not an exact science. And it's just about trying to be as detailed and nuanced as I can with the time that I do have.
Well, you will probably be able to attest to this really well. One thing seems to be constant when looking at prospect rankings. Alexis Lafreniere going number one. And I guess you could say two
Yeah.
things seem to be constant because Quentin Byfield seems to be the consensus number two. Why does it seem so certain that these two are the 1 and 2 picks?
Well, I think with Alexi, it's been a long time in the making here. He has sort of played the extra year in junior hockey. He's a little bit on the older side of this draft class, so he's had some more time in the limelight to really establish himself in terms of the context of this draft. And I think what has emerged with Alexi over the last 2, 3 seasons, even and before that, honestly, when he was playing minor hockey and he had become quite a star in Eastern Canada, was just that he was more mature than a lot of the other players in the draft. There are no holes in his game, even though this is a draft that I would say really runs 8 or 9 star level prospects deep, which is pretty rare for an NHL draft class. I still think in that context, he has fewer holes than those kids. There's less to worry about in terms of projecting him to the next level. He's physically mature. He's advanced in age. He's advanced in the way that he processes the game and thinks about the game offensively. His defensive game has come a long way. And then he's got a versatility to him offensively that a lot of these kids who can be a little bit more one-dimensional often lack. So Alexi's the kind of player who's going to step into the NHL right away and be an impact player, and that's pretty rare. So I think that's how he has managed to establish himself as kind of the clear-cut favorite. And then it's interesting with Quinton as sort of that number two, in that at the start of the year, at least the first half of the year maybe, he was that clear-cut player for a lot of people, and I think that has actually changed a little bit in the second half, following the World Juniors, where he was pretty quiet in a limited role. Things like that began to creep in. He's a little bit on the younger side. There are question marks about how ready he is to step into the NHL next year, which is Obviously, if you're looking to draft a kid second overall, then you'd want him to be a sure thing in terms of coming into NHL camp and that kind of a thing. And then the emergence of Tim Stützle as a top prospect has kind of made that case an even stronger one in terms of maybe Quinton Byfield's available at number 3 all of a sudden to the Ottawa Senators. So I think it's probably closer to 50-50 with those two kids now in terms of that 2 to 3 range. But the interesting about Quinton relative to Alexi is that Alexi's this sure thing and Quinton is anything but. So in drafting a player like Byfield, you're drafting a player who you're willing to take a swing for the fences on. That the upside is there, maybe even more so at just being a 6'4" center with a ton of skill. Maybe he's even more talented at the top of his ceiling than a player like Alexi Lafreniere is. But there's risk involved. There are warts to his game. He's got a hunch to his stride that some scouts are concerned about in terms of projecting him forward. His defensive game isn't where just about any scout would like it to be for a star level player like he is. So it might take him a little bit longer than Alexi to get there. But I think in Quinton, what you have is just this exciting potential of what could be. And we know in looking at the NHL these days, there aren't a lot of 6'3", 6'4" centers who are top of the lineup players. So anytime you can get that kind of a prospect through the draft, that potential Evgeny Malkin, that potential Eric Stahl, that potential Mikko Rantanen or Blake Wheeler, these sort of tall, big forwards who can still make an impact offensively, those players are extremely hard to come by. So that's the allure of a prospect like Byfield, I think.
Scott, you mentioned Tim Stützle is playing in Mannheim, Germany right now. I have seen him on some lists as high as 2, as you mentioned. You have him at 7. So you obviously see a bit of downside to drafting him as high as 2 or 3. What is that downside?
Well, I think for me, it's always been a sort of clear-cut 1-2 with Alexi and Lafreniere. And then the argument in favor of a player like Tim Stützle at 3rd overall, over the course of the season, I just felt like his case wasn't quite as strong as some of those other kids. And that isn't to say that I don't think that he doesn't have a case. I think there's an easy argument to be made that Tim Stützle is the 3rd best player in this draft and that the Senators should go ahead and take him 3rd overall, if you will. But I think in what I saw in him over the course of the year was a player who in the second half wasn't as impressive as he was in the first half. I think a lot of people in this sort of public and private sphere in terms of scouting and this scouting industry that we all sort of exist in had decided after the World Juniors when he was electric before getting sick for the final 2 games against Kazakhstan that he was the sort of star prospect that he had with his brilliant skating ability and his brilliant ability to play in transition, that he was this sort of locked in top 2 or 3 pick. And then I think what happened is after he came back from that illness in the DEL, he wasn't quite the same player. And despite the fact that he's probably going to be the best skater in the draft and the best transition player in the draft, I have worries about his defensive game. I have worries about his consistency offensively in terms of his ability to score goals. So there are little sort of quirks to his game that I'm less wowed by, I think, than a lot of people have come to be. And then the big thing for me is that he tends in games to get a little bit too wound up. He can get caught up in a game. He doesn't downshift and slow down as well as some of the other players at the top of the draft. So that ultimately for me gave it a slight edge to some of those other kids like a Cole Perfetti or a Lucas Raymond or a Marco Rossi, who I think do a better job not only of playing at top speed, which Tim does better than anyone, but of slowing the game down when they have to, of processing through layers of pressure and sort of layers of defenders and playing in trouble and playing in traffic and all of those things those players do at an elite level. And I think that Tim, when he gets wound up, just needs to sort of calm down and draw it back in a little bit sometimes. And I think that's ultimately what kept him a little lower on my board. But again, that isn't to say that Tim isn't a special prospect. He absolutely is. He's going to be one of the sort of 10 best prospects in hockey after draft day. So he's a star prospect. He could be one of the more dynamic players in this class. There were just a couple of things that kept him a little bit lower on my board.
You mentioned 2 more prospects that I really wanted to ask you about in Cole Perfetti and Marco Rossi. Marco Rossi is at 3 on your list. Cole Perfetti is at 4. These are 2 guys that we've talked a lot about here on the Word on Woodward because they could definitely be there at that 4 spot for the Red Wings to take. And Marco Rossi, you said he's as close to a perfect hockey player as you can think of in your article. So we'll start with him. Why is Marco Rossi so high on your list?
I think it's the versatility and the depth that he has to his game. A lot of these kids excel in one area. That's a tendency for virtually every top 17, 18-year-old kid, and that's not a knock on any other prospects. But what has made Marco special for me all along is the reality of his game is that he's good at everything. There's nothing in his game where you can look at him and say he's deficient there. There were concerns briefly, I think, about his skating and whether his skating was going to be high end enough to sort of keep up at the NHL level and make the kind of plays that he made in junior. But virtually everywhere else in his game, his ability to make plays, his ability to finish in tight, his ability to play with the puck off the rush or play with it on the cycle, where despite being 5'9", he's always one of the strongest players on the ice and people just kind of bounce off of him when he has the puck on his stick. All of those things combine to make a brilliant player. And then on top of that, he's also got the best defensive game in the draft for a forward, at least. So he's going to be able to penalty kill. He's going to be able to take difficult sort of defensive zone faceoffs. He was an unbelievably good sort of faceoff specialist in the OHL last season. He's great on penalty shots. So there's no area in his game that has me worried. I'm not worried about the fact that he's 5'9", and I'm no longer worried about his skating. So I think that well-roundedness just ultimately gave him a slight edge on maybe some other kids who are more talented on face value in terms of their upside and their ceiling offensively. I think a Cole Perfetti could go on to sort of put up more points in the NHL, if you will, or a Lucas Raymond could go on to put up more points in the NHL than Marco Rossi. But I think in Rossi, what you're going to have is the better defensive player, the more well-rounded player, the player who you can trust in more than just those offensive situations. And that's what's going to distinguish him as his career sort of progresses here. So I think that's what makes him special.
So 5 and 6, you've got the Swedish wingers in Lucas Raymond and Alexander Holtz. But I want to jump to Jamie Drysdale for a minute here, because you have him at number 8, but nonetheless, he is the number 1 defensive prospect on your list. And I've heard a few times that he could be a definitive number 1 defenseman. Do you feel that same way about him?
I think it's possible. I think when you look at the number 1 defenseman in the NHL, he doesn't really look like them. So that's where some of the concerns come. He doesn't look like Victor Hedman or Roman Josi. The top players in the NHL, especially on defense, are still sort of 6'2", 6'3" defenders who can kind of do it all. And while the game is getting smaller at forward and faster at forward, it has still been a little bit slower to catch up on defense. And certainly players like Quinn Hughes are making a case for themselves, and Charlie McAvoy and a number of others who aren't those sort of physical, big, towering, all situations, 30 minutes a night defenders, but have still carved out a niche like that kind of a player. So maybe the game's changing that way. And I think that certainly benefits a player like Jamie Drysdale. He is a brilliant skater, so that it sort of creates less concern, if you will, for some of the length or the physicality that he lacks, because he's able to stick with offensive players, to be disruptive in his gaps, to close his gaps early, to sort of glue himself to opposing players. Then suddenly you don't need that long stick as much. You don't need that physicality as much, because you're constantly a nuisance and you're not sort of getting turned around because your skating is a problem. So I think defensively his skating is going to become a major asset. And then the question is whether his offensive tools are dynamic enough to be that kind of number 1 that you want. I think Jamie projects pretty safely as a number 2, number 3, number 4 type who can sort of play in all situations, help out on your first or second power play unit potentially, maybe even help out on your second penalty kill, that kind of a thing. But the concern with me in his game is he dynamic enough offensively outside of being a very good passer and kind of playmaker type? Can he score goals? Can he activate into the offensive zone to sort of be a threat in other ways? And I think that's still to be determined. I think I would like to see him progress offensively and develop a sort of more dynamic quality to his game offensively than is currently present. But anytime you have a player who's as smart as he is and who can skate like he is, there's huge, sort of tremendous value there for a defenseman like that. So I think the game is trending towards players like Jamie who rely on their skating and rely on that sort of heads up first pass and the simple play across the offensive zone blue line and all of that. And then if he can develop another offensive element, then suddenly you're talking instead about him as a number 2 or a number 3, maybe you're talking about him as a number 1 and the kind of player who also gives you sort of 40, 50 points a season at the NHL level and runs your top power play.
All right, Scott, I'm going to ask you to kind of do the impossible here and predict what Steve Yzerman might do with that number 4 pick for the Detroit Red Wings. I know we don't know who's going to be off the board once we get there, but out of the prospects that we've talked about, and Steve has said himself that this Red Wings team needs improvement anywhere. So it's really hard to dial in on who we think they are going to pick. But out of those prospects, who do you think has the best fit here in Detroit?
I think one of those sort of top forward prospects makes a lot of sense. If it goes 1, 2, 3, like we all kind of expect it will, and Tim Stützle and Quinton Byfield are gone, and you're looking at that next group of prospects, I think all three of Rossi, Raymond, and Cole Perfetti make a lot of sense. I think Cole in particular, who I haven't really touched on here, could be a great fit in this sort of Detroit organization in terms of the prospect of him potentially playing with a player like Philip Zadina or playing with a player like Anthony Mantha. Those are two players in particular who need other players not to get them the puck to be good, but they need players around them who are creative, who are crafty, who can make plays to get them the puck in positions to score, who can utilize other skills that help them get open and draw attention to themselves. And Perfetti is a kid who does all of those things at an exceedingly high level. He is the smartest player when he's on the ice. He makes his teammates better. Goal scorers have typically excelled with him not because he's some brilliant creative passer like prospects like Trevor Zegras and others are, but because he knows how to draw attention. He knows how to create space for his line mates. He knows how to make plays off the rush or off the cycle and sort of be the guy on a line who creates for everyone else. And then he also has the skill that's needed to score goals and finish off plays. He's got exceptional hands, sort of in tight and up high on goalies in terms of his ability to go to his backhand. He's an excellent finisher with his wrist shot and with his release. So there's a lot in Cole Perfetti that I think would make a lot of sense for an organization like the Red Wings. And then the bonus for a player like Cole Perfetti is that he is, and I don't say this lightly, he is the most articulate, well-spoken, intelligent kid I've ever interacted with in terms of doing the coverage that I've done of the NHL draft for the last 7 years. So he's a special kid on and off the ice. And I think at 4, he makes a lot of sense in terms of where the Red Wings are trending, where Steve Yzerman wants the team to be trending in terms of the kinds of players that he's picking. And then also just in terms of the players that will kind of be moving around him. And Perfetti seems like that sort of picture perfect player that they need, that sort of next piece of the puzzle that gives them a little bit of everything in their lineup offensively. So I think Cole makes a lot of sense for them.
Scott, one last question for you. We talk a lot about the Red Wings' high first round pick, but they have 3 second round picks and 2 third round picks. And Steve Yzerman has a history of drafting well in those rounds. He picked Nikita Kucherov in the 2nd round and Braden Point in the 3rd. And both of those guys are competing for the Stanley Cup right now. How important are these later round picks for the Red Wings? And who are maybe some sleeper picks that they could get late in this draft?
Well, I think they're crucial because they don't have, they're not well positioned like, say, the Ottawa Senators are with 2 high picks that can sort of completely change your organization in the blink of an eye. They have to continue to hit on those other prospects. And they've hit on players like Antti Tuomisto and others in the last couple of years. I'm a big fan of Jonathan Berggren. So they've begun to find real value in that sort of 2nd, 3rd, 4th round range. But it doesn't mean that the job's done, as we know, and you have to keep hitting on those kinds of picks. So I think if I'm sitting at the draft table with the Detroit Red Wings, my advice is simple. And in this draft, I think you're going to see some defensemen go too high. I only have a handful of defensemen in that sort of top 31 range on my board. And we know every year that 7, 8, 9, 10 often defensemen go in that kind of a range. So when defensemen inevitably start to slide up, what will happen is that some very talented forwards who I believe to have first round talent are going to slip into the 2nd round, maybe even slip into the 3rd round. So there are a number of players in that range that I would think to target and take that sort of Nikita Kucherov swing that he has been comfortable taking in the past, or that Braden Point swing that he has been comfortable taking in the past, and really look for talent that may have some warts or may have some things that kept them out of the 1st round, but that you can really work with. Take the smaller player who's got a ton of skill. Take the kid whose defensive game may be lacking, but who has dynamic offensive sort of flair or potential. So when I think about those kinds of players that maybe have flown under the radar, or forward prospects that I think could be available in that range that have a ton of value, I think about kids like a VT Miettinen. VT Miettinen is a kid who played in the junior levels in Finland over the last couple of years and was one of the best player at the top sort of under 20 level, if you will, for each of the last 2 seasons, but didn't get the limelight of playing in Liga and of playing pro hockey in Finland because he was committed to come over and play at St. Cloud State and go the college route. So I think that the sort of holding him down that happened in Finland, because when you're a committed college player, you're not allowed to turn pro, that has created a sort of less buzz about a player like Miettinen than maybe he deserves on talent. I think he's going to come over to St. Cloud and be a fabulous player and really establish himself as a potential top 6 kind of talent as a prospect. And then the other kid that often comes to mind in that kind of a range is Carter Savoy, who played in the junior A level in Canada, which is our tier 2 level here, and was one of the best goal scorers in the league, but didn't have the limelight of playing in the CHL or of playing for a top program. He didn't have this sort of flair and pop that you get to see at the top prospects game. He didn't have the big stages to showcase himself. So Carter Savoy is a player who's committed to the University of Denver. I think he's going to, within 2 or 3 years, be one of their most dynamic offensive players. He is one of, if not the sort of top 5 playmaking goal scorers in this draft. So he can create for himself, maybe not his line mates as well as you'd like, but he can create for himself one-on-one, sort of scoring from long distance, scoring from tough angles, as well as anyone in this draft class. And I think that goal scoring ability is the kind of ability that you don't pass up on in round 2 or 3. So kids like that would kind of be my target. Look for this sort of big swings. If you miss, you miss. But if you hit, you have a chance at a special player. And I think those are the players that distinguish a team over the course of a season or over the course of a decade. And it's not hard to find in free agency those depth pieces that can fill out a roster. It is hard to find players like Carter Savoy who can score like he can, or like a VT Mietinen who has maybe first round talent but didn't get the limelight that he deserves. So that's the kind of players that I would look to target in those sort of second, third rounds. And I think even if you hit on 1 of 3, you're probably in a better position than hitting on 2 of 3 of a different kind of player. So I'm looking for that impact, sort of high ceiling talent at that range.
Scott, thank you so much for the wonderful insight on the upcoming NHL draft. Red Wings fans, make sure you stay tuned to the Word on Woodward and the Red Wings social media for all of our draft updates. Again, Scott, thank you so much for joining us. And a big thank you to Miller Lite for presenting the headliner. Miller Lite, the original light beer with great taste and only 96 calories, available for delivery.